Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined on Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Tommy Craggs. Tommy, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you. I am the enterprise editor at Mother Jones, and I've been there a couple of years now.
So thanks for coming on. So we're going to be talking about an article that you published in Mother Jones. The headline is "What's the Matter with Cultural Politics?" and the subhead is "It's Not Just the Economy, Stupid." And we'll include the link on the blogging site for people who want to find it. So the piece interested me as someone who's interested in sort of cultural politics, and also I guess my view of politics is also sort of shaped by a sort of vulgar Marxism of a kind that maybe you critique in the piece, and you kind of, I don't know, there's a synthesis that you're proposing between these things, sort of explaining American politics, but sort of the thing that you're arguing against is this idea that a lot of sort of center left types have been propounding since the election, but also for a long time, and that's that the Democrats did badly because they're too focused on cultural issues and not on economic issues or bread and butter issues, meat and potatoes issues. And you quote some of the people who've been arguing this, like former Senator Claire McCaskill and the comedian Bill Maher. And you mentioned What's the Matter with Kansas, this book that I think it came out in 2004.
Yeah.
And I remember reading it when it came out and found it very interesting. And of course, so your title plays on that. So that's sort of it's in some ways, even though Biden won, sort of like the left side of the spectrum is engaging in like an autopsy, trying to figure out like how did it all go wrong, and the right side actually, which lost, at least lost at the top of the ticket, is like Trump leading the way, saying actually he won. So there's something weird about that. But I guess Biden didn't win a landslide, and the Republicans did well below the ticket. So there's some reason for the Democrats to have a sort of, autopsy type thing happening. But what is your critique? First of all, did I explain the sort of centrist view correctly, and what's your critique of it?
That's right. And I would say also, as you mentioned Tom Frank and What's the Matter with Kansas, it's not limited to sort of the center left. I think this is also something that people on the left have been saying. There is like actually this sort of weird transpartisan consensus on this sort of thing, on the idea that that Democrats are talk too much about, now it used to be political correctness, now it's still political correctness, but we also talk about wokeness. There are a lot of different code words and a lot of different, trans issues come up quite a bit. Obviously, this comes up with respect to police abolition, Black Lives Matter, defund the police, that sort of thing. But yeah, the basic idea there, the basic criticism that is being made is that Democrats cost themselves votes by talking about wokeness and issues of identity and what we might call cultural politics. And this has been, this note, you see it over and over after wins, after losses. It comes up over and over again, basically since, I think going back like half a century now. And so the piece kind of grew out of, specifically it grew out of having MSNBC on for 2 weeks straight right around the election, and just hearing people hit this note in different ways over and over and over, and seeing people I generally agree with, and I find myself agreeing with, sort of, enthusiastically, retweeting or whatever, Andrew Yang talking about this sort of thing. And so that like gave me a lot of pause, and that just generally made me sort of annoyed. I think like you, I had read the Tom Frank thing in 2004, and that felt like, at the time, that felt like the skeleton key to American politics. I thought, like, this guy has it all figured out. And I think in the last 15, 16 years, I've like basically come to the realization that he had it very wrong, and in fact, Tom Frank's kind of politics are a constitutive element in this like stalemate that I think we all feel, this just sense that we are going nowhere. And so the piece that I guess you very nicely described it as an attempt at a synthesis was like trying to find some way out of this stalemate.
Mm-hmm. And so thinking back to Frank's book, so it must have come out either he wrote it before the 2004 election or it actually came out before the 2004 election. So either way, but it seemed to explain what had happened, where a lot of Democrats thought we're putting it all on the line to take Bush out, and then he won rather handily, won re-election, increased his margin over 2000 when he didn't win the plurality vote. Even I think he won like 50.1%. But anyway, and that was when gay marriage was first like on the ballot in different states and in Ohio, and it kind of did seem like the Democrats. So the thesis is like, why do a state like Kansas that used to be like a breeding ground for radical people 100 years ago, why are they now like it's either wacko far right conservatives or like moderate conservatives winning every time? And as I recall, it was like the people will vote against their true economic interests because they are fooled into through culture war demonization or racial demonization or something to side with the side of capital instead of the side of labor. So something like that.
Yeah. And I guess that's one thing I should say about my piece is that that tendency to kind of cleave politics into like material versus cultural and material versus this sort of ineffable identity, cultural stuff. That's what Frank was doing, and I think what I'm trying to argue in the piece is that like there are you can't really separate those two things. That there are material dimensions to these cultural issues. There are material consequences to being able to marry your partner, and like in especially in the case of trans issues, there are very clear material dimensions to the subordination of trans people in America right now. If you just look at some of the surveys and their salaries and the likelihood that they get fired, all these things have very clear material dimensions. So yeah, that was the other part of the thing my piece was trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And let's bracket the trans aspect of this, because in some ways it may be the role that the trans issue, or to talk about it in sort of a blunt way, like is playing in these past 5 years, like the role that like the gay marriage issue played 15 years ago. But you so one of the points, but let's bracket that for now. But you mentioned that abolish the police or defund the police. A lot of people on the like more center left side of the party are blaming those sorts of activists for the down ballot losses. I don't know if there's any way this will ever be proven. But in places that had very strong like Black Lives Matter rallies or movements, or even like violence caused by protesters or looters or rioters, whatever, like those aren't the areas that shifted. I don't think. But you note that defund the police, that's an economic argument. At its core, like defund, we're talking about money here, and taxpayer money, nonetheless. So there's that, but of course there's also like, the sort of civic religion of policing that has like grown even stronger as the counterweight to the Black Lives Matter movement, where people, are flying those blue striped flags, and right. It's beyond just sort of a budgeting issue. It's like what sort of America do we have issue?
Right. Exactly. And I think like the history of the law and order turn really bears out the idea that there are both like at once cultural and material dimensions to policing. I think in the piece I quote a senator, McClellan, from the 60s, sort of inveighing against all at once. He's talking about socialism and creeping communism, but also like this threat of civil rights protesters and violence surrounding them, and he's talking about all these things at basically the same time in this quote. And this was I read this in a great piece that kind of gets at some of the ideas here in the context of policing by David Stein, and I can't remember where it appeared, but that is certainly worth reading because I think that really zeroes in on just like the unity of material and cultural issues. But yeah, like there's a clip that I included in the piece that's Bill Maher talking about, all these instances of sort of democratic and left overreach, and he drops defund the police into this litany, and it's like when you start to think about it, it kind of you don't really pick up on it because we hear this so much, but when you actually start to think about it, like this isn't just some instance of like cancel culture run amok or whatever. This is like a very like material demand. It's like you may not agree with it, you may not think it's a good idea, but it's not like it is a material thing. It is a material claim. And it was sort of telling just to see him talk about it in such a, dismissive way.
Right. Okay. So do you agree that defund the police may have hurt the Democrats? Are you agnostic or do you disagree?
I mean, I don't really care. And I don't think, I mean, I tried, I don't think I articulated this very well, but in the piece, but I do think there is this, like, just the whole idea of a backlash is kind of a misconception. And it's one of these metaphors that actually obscures more than it clarifies. I mean, the whole idea of a backlash, comes from this, like it's a mechanical metaphor, right? Like one part of a machine, at odds with some other part of the machine. And in the case of something like policing and just, in general, just the subordination of other, some classes to the prerogative of another class, like that's not just a part of the machine in America. That is what the machine does. And this idea of backlash of like two different parts, constituent parts sort of clashing against each other. That's not actually what a backlash is describing. The backlash is describing is like the privileged class sort of reasserting or asserting itself, and asserting its dominance again. So yeah, I have a hard time kind of teasing apart. Well, what's backlash and what's just a thing America has always done over and over.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, the backlash understanding of politics is would you characterize it as the mainstream understanding, like the average MSNBC pundit, like that's the filter through which they view politics. Yeah. It's like you could try to do something and it'll help these number of people, but it might piss off these other number of people, and then you got to decide whether it's worth helping the people over here if it's going to piss off the people over there, if they're going to like get mad at you and vote you out of office or something like that.
Yeah, and I think specifically it's sort of the product of indexing your politics to like very particular kind of voter and the like sensitivities of a particular kind of voter. It's the when Clara McCaskill talks about losing some voters, she doesn't need to say what she has in mind for you to envision. She's talking about white people, mostly, white people in the Midwest. She's talking at once about working class white people and middle class white people, which is another thing that happens in this discourse is this like sort of slippage between working class and middle class.
Right.
But yeah, in this, like, the idea of backlash is sort of comes out of this like larger idea of seeing those people at the center of American politics.
Right. And so you also discuss the term you use is stalemate, and there's a kind of like austerity, mindset, even if not like literal austerity, just like sort of, I don't know, the idea of like there's only so much bandwidth or there's only so much stuff we can do. And yeah, if you do too much, then there's going to be a reaction. And I don't know, I don't know, I can't decide whether I agree with your critique or not. I mean, like just looking at sort of things that have been proposed, like that probably won't even happen, but who knows? So one of them would be like this idea that Biden, through some sort of executive order, can cancel some amount or maybe all student debt because the debt is actually like held by the federal government, and they just will say like, okay, this is forgiven, and then suddenly, millions of people out there who borrowed money to pursue education don't have to pay, $100 or a couple $100 per month. So seemingly there's no like losers from that, because the loser is the federal government. Their loans aren't going to be paid back, but the federal government can create money by pressing a button, so it doesn't really matter. But, just looking on Twitter, which is a weird subsection, but anytime this idea is proposed, there's like people who are like, I scrimped and saved, I had 2 jobs, I was working the night shift at the diner and stealing glances at my law book so that I could like graduate with no student debt, blah, blah, blah. Like, why do you deserve to get like this freebie? And like it just riles people up, even when they're not losing anything. It's just like they didn't get something that wasn't possible at that time, but still it really pisses people off. So how can we possibly break out of this mindset when even it's not like we're even taking something from these people who graduated from college 20 years ago. It's just like they get mad because they see someone else get free ice cream.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess part of the thing that I'm sort of advocating here is by catering to that kind of like conception of like hydraulic politics, one goes up here, goes down here. You're just you're just sort of reifying the problem, right? And I guess like the thing that I keep thinking and in where I sense like the energy going in politics is to these ideas that break out of this like hydraulic conception. And so it's like it's MMT right now, and it's like
that's modern monetary theory.
Yeah, which is like having a bit of a moment, and like if you fall deep enough into it, it kind of it becomes a sort of metaphysics, and almost like hits these notes that I imagine sort of New Age hit in the 70s. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. Like it is offering a way out, and like MMT offers a way out.
Okay, so just for people who've never heard of it, and I know the basics of it but don't really understand it, can you just give a brief definition of what modern monetary theory is?
Well, I think it has a lot of sort of satellite ideas, and there's like a theoretical end of it and a humanities end of it. But the basic conceit is that if you are producing a sovereign, you have a sovereign currency and you're producing your own currency, you're not going to run out of money. And essentially money is infinite and has infinitely creative capacities that have been obscured by and this is where I think you'd rather talk to somebody in the MMT world, but obscured by this kind of conventional history of money as this unit of barter. They sort of they rely on this like anthropological history that like David Graeber popularized in his book Debt. And there are like really fascinating sort of downstream implications of this idea that money is infinite. And like there are wonky considerations here that are way beyond my capabilities of understanding about like how you control, like what sort of levers you work to control inflation, all that stuff. That's not the part that like, I mean, I really can't grasp any of that. But the part that really interests me is this idea of, like breaking out of these conceptions of scarcity and politics, sort of hemmed in by these ideas of scarcity that like I grew up with. Anybody who's like been on the left in the last 15 years is like, knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's like it's just, and certainly anybody who's been on the left for longer than that. And so MMT does, I think part of the popularity of MMT is that it does offer a way out.
Right. So just to recapitulate, I think as my understanding is, the traditional idea was that if the government prints too much money, eventually you get inflation. And then in the most extreme example, you have like, Zimbabwe or something where people are carting around billions of paper dollars to buy food. But the challengers to this idea are saying that like if you control your own currency, then really there is no limit on the amount of money you can put out without getting inflation. And the fact that there has essentially been zero inflation since the Great Recession is maybe a point in favor of this theory. Although I know that there's like liberal and left economists who reject this idea.
Yeah, but I think it is, trying to get at why it's having a moment right now beyond just like sort of the wonky end of it. I think is really important, and similarly, and I think relatedly, just abolition as a conceptual framework, beyond just police abolition, but like abolition and this idea of I use the phrase at the end of the piece, this all at onceness kind of comes from just things I've been reading about abolition and the abolition as a conceptual framework. I think this is where the energy is going, because these are the ideas that seem to break the stalemate and that like move outside of it or seem to operate kind of outside of it. And I guess where I start to despair is where like we just still feel caught in the same kind of discourse that we've had for 30, 40 years. And so that was like sort of the impulse behind the piece.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly the coming Biden administration does not seem likely to break us out of whatever paradigm we were in before. I'm thinking another word you could use to describe this sort of mindset is zero sum. And the Robert Wright, who created this website, he wrote a book called Non-Zero in the late 90s. That's about how non-zero sum relationships, which are like mutually profitable for both sides. There's a sort of a logic to those flourishing in certain ways, in a way that a plain zero sum relationship, one side wins and one side loses. And yeah, but in that conception, most exchanges under capitalism are non-zero because someone gets a good in exchange for money or whatever. So I don't know how that fits in, but okay, so I think one of the sort of the thing that, aside, like if George Floyd had not been murdered by that cop, then the summer would have been different. But maybe the thing that would have gained attention as sort of the thing that Claire McCaskill would have been talking about is trans issues, and even just the fact that I'm calling it trans issues is a way of sort of setting the terms of this. But I do so in some ways, like I said, the trans stuff is the next generation or sequel to the gay marriage debates, which are now pretty much firmly settled, and probably most people don't even think or care about that anymore, even though it seemed like a huge deal in 2006, and like Obama opposed it originally, and et cetera, where now it just seems like settled, even though it was only 5 years ago that the Supreme Court, made gay marriage legal nationally. It almost seems like of a different world, settled issue, whatever, much ado about nothing almost. But I don't know, like it does seem like trans issues are more like present a bigger challenge to like the conventional way of life, the like bread and potatoes, or meat and potatoes way of life than letting gay people get married or serve in the military ever really did, because in a lot of ways those were sort of like bringing a disenfranchised group into like the establishment sort of thing. Like, is there anything more conservative than getting married? Like it's something fuddy-duddies do. So whereas I don't know, like the emergence of like the rhetoric around trans issues, I'm trying to say this carefully, of course, it like challenges conventional thinking much more. And suddenly, if you grew up thinking there were two genders, well, maybe you're wrong, and maybe you're a bigot for thinking that way. The thing is, there's not like, most national politicians are not really paying attention to this stuff in any way. Maybe I think Elizabeth Warren said something like she would ask a trans school child to pass judgment on her education secretary or something strange like that. And then sometimes, basically, it just seems like most of the like elected officials are mostly just sort of like flattering or appeasing an interest group in the way they talk about this stuff, and they're not really going after the material demands, like covering like surgery and health insurance and stuff like that might actually upset things. Then you have things like Tulsi Gabbard just a couple of days ago announced she was sponsoring a bill that would, I guess, like prevent trans children from participating in sports or something along those lines. I don't know the details of it. So do you agree with me that this is somewhat different, and it's not just like, oh, those gay people, they're gross, they're weird, I don't want to deal with them. It's like simple prejudice.
I think to the extent that it is like a direct challenge to this conception of a gender binary, and like that is kind of central to it's central to a lot of ideology and also forms of oppression. I think, yeah, like for sure. And I guess that's one thing that I keep thinking about is, the people who don't see these neat divisions between the cultural and the material, the people who actually understand this like kind of all at onceness and understand that like oppression happens along, different axes and acts in different ways. Like the people who understand that the best are the right, and that to address it, I think you can't just concede altogether. I mean that's the turf on which you have to like fight this particular fight, and it is I guess it's strange to me to see so many people ready to concede altogether, particularly people on the left. I don't know. I guess I'm not really engaging with your question there.
Well, I think like, the gay marriage fit within the Thomas Frank formulation in a pretty easy way, where it's like, let's rile up the hillbillies or whatever with this idea that like gay people are coming to like convert their children, and really their life is not affected by gay marriage in any way whatsoever, but we're going to get them like onto our side by demonizing this like persecuted minority. So that and that fits within it, but I'm not sure if trans issues fit within that in the same way. I mean, yeah, okay, so the gender binary is central to a lot of life, and it's certainly like it's more central to life in general than like racial categorizations are, I would say. And yeah, it seemed like it does seem like a more radical thing than just saying like black people should be able to vote, without the state trying to impede it, or gay people should be allowed to get married. It's just like it. I don't know, but anyway, but I still almost, but it still almost is like what is the percentage of people who are trans? I don't know, it's like 1% or something. It's smaller than the number of people who are gay, and it still does, in some ways, it still does fit within that, like, here is this group, like, you, like, middle America, in quotes, should be afraid of them, and, I will, like, protect you. The GOP congressman will, like, protect you from whatever crazy stuff, like, these people want to do to your children.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess I do want to emphasize, sort of in line with what the piece is arguing, that I just would not accept the Tom Frank formulation that this is like about whipping up fears and inflicting false consciousness on the rubes or whatever. That like, and I think that element is actually clearer with some of the like the trans panic, because that is, there are, I think we all kind of accept on some level that there are like material dimensions to the gender binary, and that has like real material ramifications. I don't think that's like, I think that's obvious to anyone. And so I think like what the trans issue actually is, and the way it is both cultural and material at once is like much clearer, I think, than, maybe with gay marriage. I'd be curious. I would actually be very curious to hear, some of the people who are involved in the gay marriage push over the the decade and a half that it took to happen, where they would see the parallels and where they wouldn't.
Right, and so when you said that, the first person who popped into my mind was Andrew Sullivan, who wrote the New York Public cover story or whatever in 1989 or something about gay marriage, and was pushing for it for a number of years. I don't quite know where he falls on the trans issue, but I have a feeling that he's not super sympathetic, but he's kind of taking a reactionary turn in the past couple of years anyway. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about like culture and materiality, which is interesting to me because as I host a podcast about culture. I enjoy culture. I'm a culture lover, but also I think a lot about how like the material conditions influence culture. So one example I just heard on a podcast yesterday. This is the Feminine Chaos podcast, which formerly was on this site, is now has spun off onto their own. And so they were talking to Jessica Crispin, who was the founder of Book Slut, the very early online book magazine. And the question was, why do a lot of like best-selling novels these days seem like they're actually like written for children? And she was saying that it's because the authors know that they want their book to get optioned by Hulu or Netflix for a series. And so for something like that to happen, you need a sort of straightforward hero, straightforward villain, maybe some science fiction-y or fantasy elements to it. And then you're more likely to just make it more like, like a movie, and it's more likely to be picked up because like books don't sell as well as as they used to, but Hulu and Netflix and HBO and Amazon will pay a lot of money for that. So I don't know if that's accurate, but it's an interesting way to think about how material conditions are shaping the culture. How do you see, since you are sort of rejecting the binary, talks to me of rejecting binaries between culture and material facts, how do you see these things interacting? Does culture flow from materiality, or is it embedded within it inextricably, or how do you view it?
Well, I guess one, it might help to talk a little bit about how just I like sort of arrived at and I want to emphasize, like, I'm not offering sort of counter like reductionism to counter what the economic reductionism or whatever. This isn't. I'm not saying privilege the cultural realm over the economic. It's that these realms are right on top of each other. but I think it might help to sort of talk about how I arrived at this, and like I've definitely seen my own sort of left politics evolve over the years. But I think one, I've been working in media. I've worked in media my whole life, and in the last few years, there have been these organizing efforts. I tried to organize a union at Slate. And I've been part of also just sort of organizing within these publications, not necessarily union drives, but also a union drive. And it's been really instructive to me to watch organizing from the inside. And a lot of these drives and a lot of just radicalism within media outlets, where do they start? I think if you talk to people who've organized drives, or it's at least have been inside media companies that organize, I think you'd find that a lot of these initial conversations happen, it happens in the women's only Slack channel, where they do the salary reveal, and they start to realize just how badly they're getting screwed. And I'm half Korean, and I've been part of the, sort of POC groups at publications, and, been part of writing letters to the bosses about addressing POC issues. And I watched how that organizing takes shape, and you see people through these channels of identity developing what I think we would call, sort of a labor consciousness, and starting to see themselves as workers through these literally Slack channels that are devoted to identity. And that was that's been a really eye-opening experience for me. And I think if you look at where some of the beyond media, look where some of the effective organizing has been. I mean, look at Google, where as far as I know, there wasn't a ton of energy around organizing internally until, and if my history is wrong here, somebody should correct it. But in response to that James Damore, the Fired for Truth guy,
right? Whatever happened to that guy? I haven't heard anything from him in a long time.
But I think some of the first real, at least attempts at organizing that and actual effective organizing that took place at Google, at least from an outsider's perspective, happened in response to that. Again, organizing, solidarity developing around issues of identity interlocking with people's sense of themselves as workers in a particular context. Or you look at more recently and back in media, but I think this was a significant moment at the New York Times. You had the op-ed editor get tossed out on his ass because of an organizing effort of Black New York Times reporters and editors who couched their concerns about the Tom Cotton op-ed in terms of sort of a traditional workplace safety complaint. They said that the tweet that they all sent out said that this op-ed made them feel less safe. I don't remember the exact wording.
Yes, but something like this makes Black employees of the New York Times feel unsafe or something like that.
And so and that's the New York Times. I mean, New York Times, when was the last time? Have you ever seen anything like that happen at the New York Times? It was, to my mind, one of the more significant labor victories. And it was certainly in the part of the left I see on Twitter. I saw people sort of making fun of it when this was a big worker victory. They got, James Bennett, they got his ass out of there by organizing. They got a boss's ass out of there by organizing.
Right.
That is.
Well, okay. So you're celebrating this, and the person on the other side might say, well, this is cancel culture run amok. But let me just, you've said a lot of interesting stuff here. I mean, one is that the, sort of a technological determinism aspect to it. There's this new software that's like Slate. Essentially, it's just like chat rooms or message boards, and that's been around for a long time. But that enables employees to talk to each other a way they couldn't because the boss was maybe lurking around the corner or something, or just to have more frank or more online style conversations. And then eventually maybe they start talking about their salaries and they're like, oh, we're being underpaid. And then it's also interesting that the group, like affinity group kind of discussions lead to a like class solidarity, because like I think the orthodox Marxists would say that like the POC workers coming together is a form of false consciousness, and when they should all be uniting with everyone, in their class. But I guess this is, it is interesting to think that it kind of like works. Like, I don't know, you need to unite around, the Marxists would say maybe like they unite around the false consciousness and then the false consciousness dissolves, and then really everyone sees that they're equal, in terms of their class, and they can band together against management or capital or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the traditional the traditional sort of white leftist view is that like organizing around sort of race and identity just sort of deepens these sectarian divisions and is sort of playing the boss's game. But I think what I'm trying to get at is that, like, I mean, you think about organizing a workplace in general, you are organizing different people situated differently within this workplace. The whole goal is to identify, common enemy, common grievance, common sources of oppression, and common modes of redress. But you are talking to different people situated differently. And the idea that those differences are somehow like, those differences don't really matter, but like, the differences created by, race and these like illusory cultural issues, like those are significant and must be observed and like transcended or whatever, and not like just challenges to any kind of workplace organizing. I think that is itself part of the problem. That is an incredibly inarticulate way of putting it, but I think there's just this like overrating of certain kinds of differences that essentially like reproduce like kind of larger racist ideas about the salience of race.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe it's that as Americans we grow up with this ideology of that class doesn't actually exist in America, and it's pummeled into us so strongly that like only you need to like go, it's like a bank shot or something. You just go in another direction before like the class consciousness can emerge or something, because we're just taught that this is like anyone can pull himself up by his bootstraps, and and of course there's been a lot of anti-union activism in this country in the last 40 years. But I think I don't know. I would celebrate James Bennett getting tossed on his ass because I thought he did a pretty bad job as the editor of the New York Times. And I thought that Tom Cotton thing should not have been run for, I mean, my reasons were that Tom Cotton could issue a press release and it could be covered by the news desk. He doesn't need the platform of the New York Times opinion page, which is the only opinion page anyone in America, or at least on Twitter, cares about. No one cares what's written in the Wall Street Journal opinion page, except for this recent column about Dr. Jill Biden. But that's an exception. People are obsessed with the New York Times op-ed page. But that piece, I don't think that piece should have been published because he could have just put on a blog post on his website or something, and that would have been fine. But I also thought, so I was not shedding a tear for Bennett, but I also thought like the rhetoric about how this is like makes me feel unsafe, or makes black New York Times employees feel unsafe. I thought that was kind of like a bullshit move also, because like, does it really? Like, you're a Times reporter, and when you say unsafe, that's when like the HR managers start like perking up and like getting the lawyers like on the phone, because an issue of safety is one that like a lawsuit can be filed over. And rhetoric, there's all this conversation about rhetoric of safety and safetyism and stuff, but like, I don't know, I just like the reason not to run that piece, aside from the fact that Tom Cotton doesn't need a platform, he has a platform as a U.S. senator, is that like it was a horrible piece and it advocated for the state to inflict violence upon protesters. Not that like it made specific people feel unsafe in some attenuated way. But it was almost like meeting bullshit with bullshit, and so I don't know. I throw up my hands, I guess.
I mean, I have not talked to like my non-white friends there about that particular campaign, and so I'm not going to not going to like make any judgment on the sincerity of it, but I do think it was effective because it was couched in that way. And like you said, it pops different kinds of flags than just like making the argument you made, the sort of straightforward argument, like the editorial argument. That's just, I don't think that causes the same sort of stir.
No, it's not what gets attention these days in the existing media environment. It's just saying like, you shouldn't have published this because then people are like, what about free speech and everyone deserves to have their voice and so on. So yeah, couching it, like it was savvy, I think, too, what they did. If their goal was to get Bennett out of there, I don't know if that was really their goal, but it could have been. And like I said, I think Bennett made a lot of like shitty choices in how he ran the page since he took it over.
I do. I also would not, I would not make too many assumptions about the disingenuousness of the claim. Like there are again, like having been in sort of POC groups within editorial operations, I don't know if there are cases where people felt like immediately physically threatened, but I do think that this some of like the whiteness of these institutions does leave sort of POC reporters and editors feeling vulnerable in a way that I think that campaign conveyed very effectively. I don't think the idea there is that they set foot out onto 8th Avenue or whatever, and they're going to get punched or something. I think it speaks to like this like sort of general unease, which is like a physical unease of people being in these like very white kind of media institutions with very white assumptions, and with making very white decisions about whose lives they can be blithe about. So,
yeah, and I'll just say, arguing against my previous point, I can't speculate about what James Bennett or his editors were thinking, but it's almost there's a style of writing or opinion journalism that existed for a long time that was very much sort of like playing a clever game, and like Slate was maybe took part in this for a certain percentage of its time, where it's like, let's make a clever argument and maybe we don't really believe it, but like it's kind of funny and it's counterintuitive, and that's something valuable. And I guess this goes back to the New Republic, which we were discussing earlier, and Robert Wright and Mickey Kaus, co-founders of this website, both worked there in the 80s. But that sort of like, I mean, the piece that David Plotz wrote about how he hated pandas, that would be like the just silly version of this. But then like, did Bennett really like think about the fact that he was printing on his page, like saying like, someone should like send in like tanks and people with and soldiers with like bayonets to confront the protesters? Like he probably, I doubt he really, well, he never read the piece, we know, but also like, if anyone really stopped to think about that for a little bit, it would move beyond sort of the intellectual game aspect of it towards, like if this really happened, then Americans would die, and that's bad. So
yeah. I mean, and I think in that case too, there's also the old tradition of publishing things by public officials, and not treating them, not holding them to the sort of standards you would hold anyone else, that and that you're just a mechanism to convey some public figure's ideas about whatever, and not that you have any duty to like edit or sharpen those ideas.
Right. And I think I've done episodes on this topic before, one with David Cleon, I'm remembering, but like, it is strange that, speaking of material and technological conditions, anyone can publish anything they want on a website or on Facebook or something. And like, it's no longer that the New York Times owns the printing presses and the distribution channels such that they totally control the conversation that is happening. And yet that particular institution, because of its history, still is the one that like sets the agenda. And so like if Tom Cotton had published a Facebook post in which that was the exact same thing, people would have paid. It was the fact that like the thing that we all agree, even people who hate the New York Times agree, like this is the important thing. Every day they publish the important opinions that we all need to pay attention to. Like they were the ones who did this, who gave it their imprimatur, even if they're like, we're airing all sides of this debate sort of thing. Like that, I think that was a key thing that set off the firestorm that resulted in Bennett resigning or getting fired. But we moved a little far afield from the piece, but I want to ask about. Well, why don't we talk about where you end the piece, which is with this a scene that you witnessed in Oakland and involves this group called Moms for Housing. Could you talk a little bit about that and why you decided to end the piece with this tableau?
I mean, I guess throughout the piece, I'm sort of describing describing the stalemate and sort of the politics of the stalemate. And, I had a long section on Stanley Greenberg, who's sort of the guy behind Bill Clinton's, it's the economy, stupid. And who also, and this is something I learned in reading about him, was also in the meeting where it was basically decided that he would take a run that Clinton would take a run at Sister Souljah in, what we now see as like this central event, that your message of your economic message has to come with this cultural message of repudiating, certain Black figures.
Right.
And which I thought was like a really significant, just the fact that it's the economy stupid guy was also one of the Sister Souljah guys.
That is fascinating because Sister Souljah has become such an iconic thing that people. People were saying that Biden needed a Sister Souljah moment for a long time. He never did and won anyway. So much for that. But yeah, it is. I mean that is seen as sort of the iconic, sort of white person denouncing the Black radical. So to signal to the white voters, like I'm basically on your side, and I'm not going to put up with the nonsense, blah blah blah. Yeah.
And so I guess in doing the piece, it felt like, I don't know, I too felt like I needed some way out. And Carol Fife is she's a longtime activist in Oakland, where I live, and she was in charge. She was one of the organizers of this Moms for Housing group, which I think staged one of the most significant direct actions in recent memory, where they basically just there was a house in Oakland that was vacant, and it was owned by these flippers, this real estate investment company, and they just moved in. They just moved into this house, occupied the house. There was a big fight over this. There were eviction proceedings. The sheriffs showed up with basically a tank and AR-15s, and eventually the governor intervened, and the house was sold at a steep discount to the Community Land Trust on the condition that they keep it affordable. And so Carol Fife was instrumental in that. And she was then in the past year, she ran for Oakland City Council, and essentially on a pretty explicit abolitionist platform, and drawing on a lot of the enthusiasm she created over the Moms for Housing stuff. And so her candidacy was really exciting to me. I mean, what she did with the house itself was really eye-opening to me, and that was one of these moments that felt like she wasn't going to take on the stalemate on its terms. Like, they're just going to move the moms in. The house is empty, operating from the premise that housing is a human right. She just claimed it. They claimed it. And that idea of a really simple and very elegant idea, unhoused people deserve a house. That idea has spread. It spread to Minneapolis with the Sheraton Hotel, where this was in the aftermath of the initial Floyd protests, when this this neighborhood near, I guess, was it the third precinct? I don't remember exactly, but where they had burned down the police precinct, the hotel, it was essentially a sanctuary, and it was sort of the unhoused people moved in there. They had sort of volunteers working at it was a Sheraton hotel, and it worked for a brief period. It was actually a functional commune essentially. There have been similar things in Philadelphia and LA, and Fife and the Moms for Housing sort of inspired this, and that to me is like that's the kind of stuff that like feels like a way out to me. I mean, obviously these are sort of radical moves, but it's just that the sort of the conception of politics that leads to those moves where it is entirely outside of this sort of stalemated politics that we're so used to. And so on the day they called Pennsylvania for Biden, I went to this rally of hers where she was thanking volunteers. And it was not like, it wasn't a sort of inspiring speech or anything like that. It was her just sort of laying out the work that needs to be done. But it was interesting because it felt like really at odds with just the prevailing mood that day. Like people were dancing in the street. Everybody was like buoyant and happy. And this was definitely happy, but it was also like, she named names. She talked about, Democrats being part of the issue too. And she went through this whole litany of things. And I just listening to it, I could hear in my head the very like serious, savvy pundits sort of tisk-tisking her for like, not slipping into the like energies of the moment, even though I think she was, but also like, laying out these issues that aren't popular and being just like too aggressive about certain things. But hearing her enumerate all these different things and sort of draw a line through them and connect these things in a larger story about oppression, but also how to extract ourselves from it and how to overthrow it. Like that was actually a very in its own way moving, and just experiencing that day and seeing that alongside, sort of the dancing in the street for Biden, like that was actually a really sort of moving, just a moving day for me. So that's where the piece ends. I guess like the more prosaic way is she was presenting this kind of, the more prosaic way of talking about it is just she was presenting this sort of intersectional story about uniting these like various issues. And, but I think, she does it in a very effective way and is very, alive to these like, sort of overlapping dimensions that we're sort of talking about, cultural, economic, and doesn't feel that she needs to choose. And that if she talks about one, she has to talk less about the other or whatever. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting and you describe it well, and it's interesting for a number of reasons. I mean, think about it, intersectionality was sort of a buzzword of 4 or 5 years ago, and then after Trump came in, I guess people kind of forgot about it because it seemed, I don't know, it seemed like something of a previous era. But the core part of intersectionality, makes sort of very logical sense that anyone can understand, and then maybe people sort of apply to situations where it didn't apply, or we're using it to like get some sort of advantage over someone else. But anyway, I think what's interesting, I mean, you could imagine like the New York Times reporting on this story, or I don't know, opinion or straight news or news analysis or something, but they would be sort of like, well, I guess this had sort of a happy ending, and we're all good liberals, so we're all happy that these people like are inside of a house now instead of sleeping on the street. But like, they didn't really go by the rules, and they broke the law, and that wasn't good, and it required like Gavin Newsom to be shamed into doing something. So yeah, so I mean, they went outside the normal conception, and like maybe in the normal conception, they all just would have been arrested and like thrown out or something, and the house would have been locked up and put an armed guard or something there. But their radical action succeeded, so that's a good thing. But I can imagine the tutting, and you said the tisking of the good liberals who are like, why did you have to like break the law? Private property is the cornerstone of our system of whatever, and blah blah blah. And yeah, so that sort of action is, it's a more radical action than marching in the street and saying Black Lives Matter or something, because the things that have flowed from those protests are like, we're capitalizing the word black in news articles, and certain old sitcom episodes have like a warning label now before we show them or something like that. Whereas like, taking a piece of property that someone else owns and like saying it's mine now, well, that is like truly radical. And right. So the fact that it succeeded, well, I guess that's good, but it also like can freak people out, because who's to say that next time it's going to be like an abandoned structure or something? Why not? How about all those skyscrapers that have been built in Manhattan that they want to sell the units to Russian billionaires or something, and they're empty? Well, is that next? So these are the thoughts I've had reacting to that. Yeah.
No, I mean, I don't think anybody would deny that this was radical, but it proceeds from like a very simple and sort of like human and humane premise, right? Which is that like housing is a human right, and I think that's a really important part of this. You were talking about intersectionality, and I guess one thing that I think is germane here is that I think there is a thing that happens among the left with like a sort of understandable impatience with the way, with like the co-opted, the kind of like liberal, the co-opted versions of the co-opted language, racial justice, the co-opted forms of this kind of like cultural politics. And I think that impatience is totally justified, sort of the HR-ish. Everybody has had the experience of sitting through like a HR software thing and feeling just a little bit red-pilled by it. Uh-huh. But I think there's, while that impatience might be sort of understandable, I think there's also this like eagerness or just hastiness to conflate the thing itself with its like co-opted kind of cheapened form that appears in, sort of HR world and sort of, liberalism more broadly. Uh-huh. And I think, intersectionality sort of fell victim to that sort of thing. But I think it gets at sort of an important idea, and there are different phrases for it. Targeted universalism, and I think that idea gets at something essential to, I think, whatever has to happen next. This whatever way out we identify.
Yeah, and it seems it's very uncertain. I predicted, I was pretty certain that Biden was going to win and Trump was going to lose, but I've been thinking that Biden is probably not going to be able to accomplish much, and things will probably just be really boring, and we're back to sort of stalemate instead of like insanity happening every day. And so it might, I don't know, nothing radical. Maybe he will cancel everyone's student debt. He doesn't seem like the type of person who would, but maybe a lefty economic advisor will convince him to do it, and that would be that's similarly radical in terms of that's like something that is outside the normal parameters of the relationship between like the state and the people and capital and stuff. But yeah, so I don't know. I'm not optimistic about radical change happening from the top. So maybe it's it'll have to be bottom up for at least the next 4 years.
People moving into vacant houses. That's it.
Yeah, and so I mean the like both the overbuilding that has happened in various places in over the past 2 decades, and then the like crisis of the of the pandemic and people not being able to pay their rent and just the the increase in homeless people in cities. Like, it seems like maybe this could be a big thing. So who knows? Maybe. Maybe we should end it there. Is there anything else you want to say about the piece? Okay, so the link will be below on the blogging site. What's the matter with cultural politics is the headline if you want to Google it. Tommy, thanks for taking the time and coming on. It was a very interesting piece, and I sent it around to a couple different people saying, what do you think about this thing? It's making me think a lot. So I feel like sometimes the best like essays or something like pose the question, not provide exactly the answer. So I feel like this is one of those good pieces that like crystallizes the question, and then more, we need to continue to think about what the next step or what the answer is.
I know I'm going to spend the next however many years arguing with my own piece in my head. So.
Is there anywhere you want to point people to seek out your content in general?
Read Mother Jones, subscribe to the magazine, read motherjones.com.
Okay, cool. And people can subscribe to this show in iTunes or Apple Podcasts or whatever your podcast app is, and they can rate and review it, and that helps other people find it. Everyone knows this already. So Tommy, thanks for taking the time and coming on, and thanks to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Yeah, thank you.